My theory is the manufacturer's recommended service interval is only for them to get that thing out of their warranty period. I don't think they're that concerned with the longevity and durability of that whole system. I do not see the benefit of waiting 10 to 50, even 7,500 miles to change your oil. Am I wrong?
No. So let's put it this way. Yeah.
Should I idle my diesel engine to warm it up in the morning?
No, you should not.
Should I change my oil after, say, an Alaskan winter or somewhere where that's very cold?
It really depends upon if the vehicle's being used during that time. If it's just been sitting in the garage and it hasn't been run, no, you don't have to. But if it's been working, especially short trip driving, absolutely. Do it as soon as possible.
Is it okay to use diesel fuel additives?
Yes, actually, especially if you're in the U.S., 100% you should be using a diesel fuel additive.
Is it okay to use engine oil additives?
No. While additives for your fuel, at least here in the U.S., are a good idea, additives in your oil are never necessary.
How often should I change my oil?
It really depends on the duty cycle of the engine in the operating environment. I've seen some diesel oils, especially in Sprinter vans, be bad in 3,000 and 4,000 miles. I've also seen them go 12,000 miles and still be looking good. So it really depends upon what the environment that it's in and how it's being used.
All right, Sprinter Fix here from the future. There's just so much knowledge in this conversation. What you will hear over the next hour will completely change the way you think about oil and van maintenance. Now, we do dig a little deep into the details, but every few minutes I pull things together, summarize everything, and really try and provide actionable advice that you can use to help your van last forever. Now let's get back into it. Should the diesel engines without these modern emission systems, particularly the DPF system, should the older diesel engines that don't have those use the same oil as the new ones?
It really depends. Some of these lower SAPs formulas are actually better than the older higher SAPs formulas. But you're never going to know that unless you're doing used oil analysis. And if you're not going to do that, your best bet is just to keep the old with the old and don't put the new in the old unless you're going to do the analysis to know what is actually happening.
Interesting. We're going to have to get into that later. All right. So, Lake, tell us who you are and why we should trust what you're saying.
Well, my name is Lake Speed Jr. I'm a certified lubrication specialist and oil monitoring analyst. I've held both of those certifications through the Society of Tribologists and Lubrication Engineers for going on 15 years. This year, just had one of my anniversaries this month. For those, prior to that, I worked for Joe Gibbs Racing, and that's how I got into the field of tribology, was working for a NASCAR team, and we applied the science of tribology to our race cars, especially to our engines. And we went from, winning some races, but never winning a championship. And that was the first 8 years of Joe Gibbs Racing's existence from 1992 through 2000. But then in the following 8 years, applying the science of tribology to our race cars, we won 84 races and 5 championships. So it was a giant change for us by really beginning to work with the companies that no one knows of. Like everyone knows Shell and Exxon and Mobil and Pennzoil and all the Valvoline, all the big brands. What most people don't know is that those are pretty much brand names that they don't normally always make base oil. Not every company makes the additives. So when you're talking about motor oil, you're talking about two things, base oil and additives. There's only 4 companies on the entire planet that make the additives that go into every brand of oil in every brand of fuel on the planet. And most people don't know who those companies are. Lubrizol, Afton, Chevron Oronite, and Infinium. Now, Infinium is a joint venture between Shell and ExxonMobil. And of course, Chevron Phillips is also owned by Chevron. But Afton and Lubrizol are actually the two largest of the additive companies. And they're the two independents. And they sell to pretty much everyone. And we were fortunate enough at Joe Gibbs Racing to end up working with both of them and work closely with them to develop formulas for the race cars that helped us win races and win championships. And because of the success of that program, we ended up getting really heavily involved in the engine building community. When oil specifications changed back in the mid-2000s and reduced the level of ZDP, zinc, in the oil, it caused a lot of problems for older engines, especially engines with flat tappet camshafts. Well, we happened to have the chemical answer for that because we had the same issue at Joe Gibbs Racing. They solved it by working with Lubrizol to develop the right kind of products to break in engines and protect flat tappet cams. So we ended up getting involved in the broader engine building community around the world, supplying break-in oils and assembly greases to engine builders everywhere from the U.S. to Australia and pretty much everywhere in between. Been around the world twice, helping people with problems like this. And so that's my background. And then, a year or so ago, I decided I'd start making YouTube videos and sharing my story. And yeah, it's pretty interesting. A lot of people have a lot of opinions about oil, a lot of interest in oil. And obviously, if you have a vehicle, your engine's not going to go very far without oil. And so I've been able to share a lot of these insights and things that most people would never have the privilege to know, that we were able to know because of our close relationships with these companies. And people are finding it interesting and, more importantly, helpful. We're able to help people achieve the goals they want to achieve in terms of lubrication excellence and extending vehicle life, reducing downtime, maintenance costs, all those things.
Yeah, and I noticed on your channel you're very careful not to recommend specific brands simply because It sounds like you care a lot more about what's in the oil versus the brand name on the shelf. That
right. Most people make the mistake of choosing brand name first. Mm-hmm. And that's wrong, as you're putting the cart before the horse. Application always dictates chemistry. So you got to understand, what do I have? The most important thing that most people have in their vehicle when it comes to oil is your owner's manual. It's going to tell you what spec the oil calls for. And that spec is going to have things about it. Maybe it's the high temperature, high shear value of it. Well, maybe it might be a viscosity grade. There's going to be different things within that spec that are the keys. Now, what brand you use that's the last part of the equation. And we've proven it several times on our channel already in other tests that, the 4 companies are making these additive packages that will meet that spec. And they're selling them to lots of different companies. They're not selling a different one to brand A than they're selling to brand X. And everywhere in between, a lot of those same brands are buying the same package. So pretty much the exact same oil could be on that part shelf in front of you in a few different bottles. Now, engines don't read labels. They don't know what brand it is. They don't care what brand it is. They don't care what color it is, what dye they put in there. All they care about is the chemistry. And as long as you're giving it the chemistry that meets the spec, engine's going to be pretty happy. And that's what I call the C's get degrees, methodology. That if you use the oil that meets the spec, regardless of what brand it is, you're going to get by. It's going to do a decent job. But if you want to be valedictorian, you're going to have to work a little bit harder than the person that got the C in school. I think we all kind of understand that.
Yeah. Tell us, you mentioned a little while ago about the changes to oils in the mid-2000s. Tell us a little bit about how that affected the diesel engines or some of the causes of those changes around that time for diesels.
So for diesels, the big change, started coming in the late 2000s. That's when you went from CI4 to CJ4. And that's really when you had, advent of ultra low sulfur diesel. You had EGR systems going on the vehicles. You had DPFs going on vehicles. And all of that was emissions related. So the big change then was about lowering the ash content, the saps, if you will, of the oil. Now, pretty similar in the diesel world to what happened in the gasoline engine world when they first put limits in place. The CJ4 limits were only a couple hundred parts per million, especially on the ZDP, less than what was typical in the marketplace with CI4. So, for example, CI4 oils that were out there would be somewhere in the 1,200 to 1,400 parts per million range when it comes to the zinc and the phosphorus. And they were usually 2,800 to 3,000 parts per million on the detergent, calcium detergent levels. When you went to CJ4, that dropped to 1,200 parts per million on the zinc phosphorus levels. So it tuned it down a little bit. In the reality, what a lot of companies did is they just took that same additive package they were using as CI4 and they just downtreated it slightly. So where maybe the previous drain interval, let's say, was 15,000 miles. Well, now you downtreated it. Well, now it's 12,000 miles or 11,000 miles. That's what happened with a lot of the companies early on. Then as things began to develop further and we get to CK4, that was more of a step change. And that 1,200 parts per million limit was still in place, but now they had a better understanding by the time you got to CK4 of what was happening in the marketplace. And just like on the gasoline side, they were saying, the engines we're using to test this stuff are really old and they're not really representative of what's in the marketplace now. So we're going to come up with a new line of engines and start testing these new oils with newer engines to make sure they're focused on it. And soot handling has become the predominant issue. Because of EGR, you're getting so much more soot moving throughout the engine that the soot handling characteristics of the oil have become paramount. And you can see that if you ever, I don't recommend anybody doing this. Put a passenger car oil in your diesel and watch how the wear takes off. Same viscosity, have the same ZDP level. It can even have pretty similar detergent level, but the dispersant chemistry in a gasoline oil is so different than what's in a diesel oil that it can't handle the soot, and cylinder bore wear will take right off because of that. You'll get it bore polishing pretty easy. So, that's really the biggest thing. And of course, where we are today, we have, FA4, you have lower viscosity oils pushing for fuel economy. It's scary enough to see people, OEMs, when I say people, I mean OEMs, speccing 0W20 for diesels. That's pretty crazy, but I understand that it's for fuel economy and not necessarily that push for greater fuel economy, reduced emissions is a big part of why you've seen OEMs in the last 20 years move away from traditional 15W40, CI4, CJ4 type technology. And we're seeing the CK4, FA4 oils type coming in, and of course we're moving toward the next spec here pretty soon. And that's, again, just that continued evolution, just like we're seeing on the gasoline side. But you have to understand the major driver in this is emissions. Now, with that being said, it's important to note that don't think that, okay, well, they're just putting these new oils in there for emissions protection and for fuel economy. I'm just going to go throw my old school CI4 oil that I can buy in drums. I'm going to put that in my modern diesel because it's going to do a better job. No, it's not. And one of the biggest things we see at Speed Diagnostics doing used oil analysis is high levels of fuel dilution is usually the biggest culprit. that's attacking modern diesel engines. And there's a few different reasons for that, but one of them is frequent DPF regens. Because the DPF, when it regens to burn off all the junk in there, will have that post-injection. So what happens with modern DPFs is as they build up soot, it has that post-injection to burn off that soot. Well, that post-injection of fuel typically drives up fuel dilution in the oil, which lowers viscosity, which increases wear. None of those things are good. So having a higher ash content in your oil will cause more frequent DPF regens, which puts you at the risk of having higher fuel dilution, thereby having higher engine wear. So sometimes you think one strategy is going to work out, but actually the unintended consequences can bite you other way if you're not being careful.
Absolutely. And yeah, I have questions about post-injection and DPFs and all that, just to kind of give the viewers an idea of how the emissions on the Sprinters has changed over the years. Was that Sprinter really came into the States in 2002, where it really just had an EGR valve, which didn't do a whole lot. I think most modern EGR valves, if you compare the maps, the newer ones are doing a little more recirculating than the old ones, and I'll have to confirm that in another video. But so, just an EGR, no DPF, emissions that didn't do too much, no filter. 2007, they bring in that DPF filter. First year in the Sprinter, they have the DPF filter. And it seemed like there was a transition period between 2007 and up to about 2014 where they were really trying to figure out how to get these emission systems to work better, because there was definitely a learning curve, if you will. First 3 years, they had that DPF filter way about, maybe 3 or 4 feet away from the engine. Didn't get hot enough frequently enough, right? Caused more DPF regeneration, that cycle you were talking about where there's post-injection and the glow plugs turn on and everything heats up and pushes those particles out, right? So 2010 comes along, they roll out some other emission stuff, SCR, which we don't need to get into now. They put the DPF a whole lot closer to the engine, had a few less issues. During that time, the expectation of the oil was, I think, what they called mid-SAPs, and please correct me if I'm wrong about this. It had the MB 229.51.
Yep.
I think the 229.52 came out a little later on. And if you have specific dates, please let me know, because it's kind of hard to figure out when some of this stuff rolled along.
No, it's pretty easy to say. The 2000s were kind of dominated by full SAPs oils. Then the 2010s, those were mid SAPs. And since it's 2020, everything's low SAPs.
Yeah.
It's an easy way of blanketing it. Yeah, there's more specific dates in there, but that's a 30,000 foot view. That's about what's right.
Okay, perfect. Now, you mentioned at the very beginning that, all right, let's take a 2006 diesel, no DPF. There's been a few updates to the engines over the years. You had an inline 5 for the first 4 years in the States. Then you had a V6, and now they're pretty much all inline, some versions of inline 4 for the Sprinter vans. Let's take a Sprinter that doesn't have the DPF system or any real modern emissions other than like a little EGR valve. And let's take the most modern with ultra low SAPs 2020 plus Sprinter. What arguments would you have for not using the same oil or using the same oil?
So I'm going to use a gasoline engine parallel here first. What we've seen with API SP, which is the current gasoline spec, it's typically the calcium levels, so your detergent levels, are going to be somewhere around 1,500 parts per million total. Usually that's about anywhere from 800 to maybe 1,100 parts per million calcium, and the balance of that is going to be in magnesium-based detergents, which were really common back in the CI4 era, having that blended detergent package between the calcium and the magnesium. The ZDP levels are right around 800 parts per million. the phosphorus levels in a passenger car with an API SP. If you go back to API SM, so go back 2008, somewhere in there, you would have had the calcium levels were going to be over 2,500 parts per million, most likely, in that era, with the ZDP only still at 800. When we do wear measure, actual engine wear measurement, we're measuring flat tappet camshaft wear. You will see much higher wear with that older API SM, that high level of calcium, compared to the modern API SP. Because the calcium detergents compete against the anti-wear additives. So by lowering the calcium, having that blended package of calcium and magnesium, you have less competition against the ZDP, which makes the oil work better. Now, the other thing that's happened too, and this does relate to diesels, we'll get there.
Yeah.
Is that as these total levels have had to come down, but you have API, you've got ASEA asking for higher levels of wear protection because the zinc phosphorus levels have been limited. They can't go higher than 800 in a gasoline engine or 1,200 in a diesel oil. They had to bring in other technologies, some type of borated additive or a molybdenum-based additive. There's other organic compounds that can be added to it that don't show up in a regular used oil analysis. Special type of esters that can be blended in at a very low dosage that will work synergistically with the ZDP and boost wear protection. So what's happened is that the modern gasoline engine oils are better at wear protection than even the older ones. Even some of the high zinc classic oils that are designed for older engines don't perform anywhere near as well, actually, as the modern lower SAPs off-the-shelf oil. And I've seen the same thing between, say, the Delo SDE, which has a lower level of zinc in it, compared to Rotella. If you compare those two side by side, Rotella has a higher SAPs, T4, compared to the Delo 400, but Delo will actually provide better wear protection, even though it has, even though they're both higher SAPs oils, right, in general. But that's just kind of a little bit of a clue and insight. So when you get to some of these ASEA, C and E classes, it's possible. I'm not saying it's probable. I'm saying it's possible that one of those oils could do a better job than a higher SAPS oil, even in an older engine. But you're not going to know that unless you're doing used oil analysis to actually measure those results. Because those oils typically are going to have more modern chemistry for handling soot. And the number one source of wear in a diesel engine is soot. So you have a more advanced soot handling chemistry. And then from the anti-wear perspective, usually you're going to have a stronger, broader anti-wear package than an older engine. Now, all of that is premised on the use of ultra-low sulfur diesel. Higher sulfur diesel changes all of that. If you're in an area where you don't have, the low sulfur, ultra low sulfur diesel, if you're using low sulfur diesel or standard sulfur diesel, 500 part per million or 5,000 part per million diesel, you have no choice. You have to use one of the older full SAPS formulas with a higher detergent level because you need that level of acid neutralization that's going to come because of the sulfur level in the fuel.
That's very interesting. Using this idea as like a case study, I assisted someone in fixing up a Sprinter so that they could export it to Nigeria, just as an example. I don't suspect there's extremely low sulfur diesel available in Nigeria? I could
No,
be wrong.
Africa is ripe with high sulfur diesel.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. So
Yes.
those circumstances, even if it was more on the modern side, utilizing some slightly more traditional high saps might be a good idea in a scenario like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I would say let's say you sent a newer one with the DPFs and all that down there, I would lean on the favor of, well, we know the fuel will do damage if you don't manage the acids. So I'm going to fall on that side of the sword and protect the engine from that, and I'll live with the consequences of maybe having to have more frequent oil changes potentially because of the DPF regen causing, obviously it's going to cause fuel economy problems, but if it ends up, causing fuel dilution problems, then you can have to work around that, because that's one of those tough situations where you've got the fuel is a part where a lot of people don't understand how fuel is not the same, even throughout the United States. It's not the same.
Yeah. Let's, I have one more question about the emissions, and then we can kind of expand on the idea of fuel dilution in the oil and maybe talk about that a little more, and idling the engine and whatnot. Now, let's take that idea to the nth degree. Someone exports their van to Nigeria. The fuel just kind of wrecks their emission system. The emission system isn't, or just, some foreign country where there's no, say they own their own island and they just drive it, that sort of scenario right there. They drive it on their own private island in the middle of the ocean. Is there benefits to using that most modern low saps oil, or would you kind of err on the more high saps side?
So really in this case, you really have to default to the oil analysis, because that's what you're going to have to when you're doing ultra low sulfur diesel. There's no need to worry about TBN. So TBN, a total base number for people who are unaware, is a old school diesel used oil test that was developed in the days of high sulfur diesel, even low sulfur diesel. But because it's measuring the acid neutralization of the oil. So that works really good. TBN's a great test when you have standard sulfur or low sulfur. But when you go to ultra low sulfur diesel, we'll call it the acidity of the fuel, or the fuel byproducts. It's not the fuel itself, it's acidic. It's the byproducts of combustion, are now so low in terms of their acidity that the very strong acid neutralizers in the oil don't really react to it. So it becomes a false negative in a lot of ways. So oxidation is a better method for judging the health of the oil. So ultra low sulfur diesel, you can use oxidation to determine oil change interval, health of the oil, health of the engine. Standard sulfur diesel, low sulfur diesel, you got to use TBN to do that. So your measuring stick, if you will, changes, from imperial to metric, when you start doing those kind of things. So when you get into these other, we'll call them oddball circumstances, back to application always dictates chemistry, spend more of your time defining the application, understanding all the variables that are at place, then make your decision based on that, and then use the correct tools to monitor your situation. That way you can guide yourself in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to circle back to oxidation value, but before that, let me just bring it back up to like a 10,000 foot view. Should we idle our engines to warm them up? When is it okay to idle the engine? When is it not okay? Why don't you get the ball rolling on ideas around that?
The biggest thing about, why you should not idle your engine to warm it up, and we'll kind of put an asterisk on this, in cold weather environments, is that your piston rings have a gap, and it's allowing blow by. It's allowing more soot, more fuel to get into the crankcase, because as the engine warms up, then that gap closes. And we've proven this several times, that extended idling doesn't really generate a lot of heat in the engine. It generates some heat, but you're actually going to get temperature in the pistons and the rings and the oil and the water. It's going to come up faster if you drive it. Now, I'm not saying go out there when it's negative 20 and crank it and then stand on the gas. No one's saying that. What we're saying is don't let it idle for 10 minutes to warm it up when it's negative 20, right? You go out there and it's cold, crank it up, let it idle for a minute or so, just to make sure oil's flowing and moving through the engine, then begin to drive away slowly and gently. Because as you put load on the engine, now and you give it more throttle, you're putting more fuel to the fire. It's going to build more temperature quickly, and that will close that gap. The tolerances will close up, and in doing so, you're going to lower the level of fuel dilution in the oil. Now, some people will say, well, once I get it, if I idle it for a while and get it warmed up, then I'm going to go drive it, and it'll burn it all off. No, you're not. Because both gasoline and diesel fuel are not single molecule fuels. They're compounds. They have some, lower boiling point constituents. They have some very high boiling point constituents. So unless you're getting your oil temperature upwards of 400 degrees Fahrenheit, which you don't want that to happen, and no, that's not happening, you're not going to boil off the heavy ends of the fuel. They're going to stay in the oil. Now, gasoline is easier to do that. It's possible to get pretty close to the heavy ends of gasoline and running the engine hard enough that you can do that, especially if you got crankcase vacuum. Positive crankcase ventilation will actually lower the pressure in the crankcase and make it easier for that stuff to boil off. Diesel's a lot harder. We typically see higher levels of fuel dilution in diesels than gasoline engines because of the higher boiling point, not the initial boiling point, the end boiling point of the fuel. So, and all that fuel does is lower the viscosity of the oil, which is reducing lubrication, shortening oil life, increasing engine wear. So for those reasons, it's way better to get some heat in the engine from dead cold. Now, if you're in southern Louisiana in the summertime, you want to go out there and crank it and let the AC cool off your truck, go right ahead. It's hot, right? It's not gonna take very long for it to get warm. If it's 100 degrees outside, it's not gonna take very long for that piston ring to close up.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And if someone does want to test this with their sprinters, do it probably before your oil change. See how long it takes to get it up to operating temperature from idle. I think I tried once. It was a van that hadn't started in 5 or 6 years. I wanted to idle it up to operating temperature before we drove it around because I wanted it to be extra safe. I think I idled it for 20 plus minutes and it still didn't quite get there. So yeah, I mean, it definitely takes a while. And it was chilly outside. It wasn't particularly cold. It was maybe sweater weather, right? So
yeah. When you're in sweatshirt weather, you're gonna have a hard time getting temperature in it. Again, if you're in South Texas, South Florida, Louisiana in the middle of summer, it's not going to be hard to get up the temperature at all. Yeah. Especially if you're not driving, right? It'll get pretty warm pretty quick.
So let's summarize the negative effects of potentially idling. Some of the negative effects that we've discussed. There exists not enough heat in the engine for there to be a small gap. Therefore, far more oil dilution occurs. So the diesel mixes into the oil. Is that correct?
Right. And so you have a couple of things. Yeah. When you have a lower temperature in the engine period, two things are going to happen. One, the clearances are wider because everything's, when it's cold, all those clearances, all the tolerances are more open. So that door is open for fuel dilution to come through. Other thing, too, is that not a single engine on this planet burns liquid fuel. Not a gasoline engine, not a diesel engine, not methanol. It burns vapor. That fuel has to go from the liquid state to a vaporized state. So when it's really, really cold and your fuel is really cold, it still hasn't reached. The whole idea of the injector is to atomize the fuel, but the atomized fuel is still liquid. When we see soot, that's just unburnt fuel. That's fuel that was atomized but did not vaporize. So it didn't burn. So when it's cold, it's harder for the fuel to vaporize. So you're going to typically get higher levels of soot. You're going to have higher levels of fuel dilution. Both of those things are negative for engine wear.
Right. So even just from the fuel perspective, even if you had, this scenario would never exist, a hot engine with ice cold diesel going into it, that would be a little worse for the engine, arguably a little more soot production.
Well, if the engine was hot, then everything's closed off, and the chances of that hot environment causing that cold fuel to vaporize, you get more change in temperature if there's a wider delta in temperature. So a hot engine with cold fuel actually would cause the fuel to vaporize quite rapidly.
Gotcha.
Now, the inverse is, would be what you were kind of saying, right? If I had hot fuel going into a colder engine, that would be better than cold fuel in a cold engine.
So there's some component to the temperature of the fuel itself that assists in,
typically, you don't have a lot of control of that. That's one advantage of the high pressure common rail. Right. Higher pressure means higher temperature. So it helps it vaporize. That's part of it, not just the finer injection, but that higher pressure common rail is generating more temperature in the fuel. It's going to make it want to vaporize a lot easier.
Yeah, and to be fair, the rail sits right on top of the engine, so it gets a bit of heat itself, right? So that's just not meaningful in any way. So let's expand on this idea of soot, because I think we've kind of gotten to this point where we're talking about the existence of soot, particularly inside diesels, being the primary cause of wear, I believe you argued, in addition to... I'm going to say that based on my experiences, as an ASTM member that was a voting member on the Lubes and Fuels division, all the ASTM diesel engine tests, and those are the ones that all the OEMs use to certify their oils, they're all soot focused. So those engine tests usually require them to pre-soot the oil before they run the test. So they're using carbon black as a soot surrogate, and they're adding it to the oil in order to make the engine wear during the 150 hours or so they're going to run the test. Because if they didn't, then it would make the test run longer, and it reduces the severity of the test. So just if you look at how they test diesel engine oils, that jumps off the page really quickly and says, oh, soot is a real thing. In fact, on the gasoline side, going from port injection to direct injection has even brought about some soot-related wear in modern direct injection engines on the gasoline side. So now they're doing things like timing chain wear, stuff like that, because even in a direct injection engine on the gasoline side, it can create just enough soot that it can pick on the timing chain rollers and cause the timing chains to stretch, which throws off the valve timing, which is not a good thing. Soot is just an enemy of every engine. It's just because diesels make a whole lot more soot. It's enemy number one. Right. Timing chain. This is a timing chain. It looks like a giant bike chain. These are the rollers. All right, back to the video. Oh, and let me know if you want to see one of these installed. Let's talk about the soot potentially caused by the EGR system. Let's talk about just the general soot just from running your engine, say, normally on the highway. And then maybe we can discuss the general soot that gets into the oil simply from idling. Would you say the primary contributing factor to diesel soot in these modern diesels is the EGR system, or is it pretty?
Well, soot is a byproduct of combustion, right? So if you could get perfect atomization and vaporization of the fuel so that when that injection happens, we're getting all of the fuel to burn. That's obviously the big benefit of the high pressure common rail, the piezoelectric injectors, where we're getting multi squirts, is because we can put in a small one and we can bring the temperature up, we can get it going, and then so that each of the subsequent ones, we're actually getting a little bit better vaporization and we're improving combustion versus the old school single big shot. Okay. The downside of that old school big single shot was there was so much wasted fuel. But even with the modern one, we're still getting soot creation because not all the fuel that sprays into there is going to vaporize. What doesn't vaporize is soot. And that soot, that is going to make its way into the oil because that piston's moving down. There's going to be oil in the cylinder walls. There's oils in the ring. And so soot is going to get into the oil. Unfortunately, on the exhaust stroke now, with modern EGR engines, some of that soot is going to get rebreathed right back into the engine, which is why when they put EGRs on the engines, we saw having more soot-related problems, is because we're not just pushing soot out the exhaust, we're rebreathing it. Yeah, so that's the biggest issue, is we're pushing soot not out the exhaust, but the soot, we're rebreathing it. And so that's causing a higher soot load. And that's really what's impacting these modern diesel engines with the EGR systems.
You touched on timing chains there. Now, you also touched on piezoelectric injectors. So I kind of want to ask you, you mentioned you did some work with Cummins and whatnot in the past, or?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So for those of you who don't realize it, whether it's a Cummins engine, or a Power Stroke engine, or a Duramax engine, if it's made at least within the last 10 years, for Cummins it's probably closer to 20 years, it's going to be using the same Bosch injectors and the fuel delivery systems on these modern diesels, whether it's a Mercedes or one of the American brands now, they're near identical in many, many ways. So when we talk about Cummins here, we can essentially make a pretty close one-to-one comparison to the Mercedes engines. Would that be fair to say, or is it my?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Everyone's following the same thing. Obviously, Bosch is the leader in that technology, and everyone's working with them to make sure they've got injectors that can do the job. And that it's from an emission standpoint, you have to have that. The soot levels come down so much when you go to high pressure common rail, piezoelectric injectors, having the multi squirts. That's just state of the art, and everyone's doing pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, and I'd say Cummins was probably the first at the table, I think, in the States when it came to working with the technology with Bosch here in the States. I think so. You could probably speak more to that.
I would tend to say that I think that's the case. I can't be positive about that, but obviously, Cummins is from what they've told me, they are the largest engine builder in the world that is not a car manufacturer.
Oh yeah, that's
the only people that build more engines than them are people who actually build vehicles. So they're the largest independent engine builder in the world, and if you go to their R&D facility in Columbus, Indiana, there's 80 dynos in that one facility. So obviously when the EPA comes up with any kind of new regulation, especially when it comes to emissions for a diesel, that is, Columbus, Indiana is probably stop number one for that. And they start working on, well, how do we figure this out? How do we make that work? If they weren't the first, they were really close to it.
Yeah. Now I'm going to get into a little bit of my own opinions here, and I'm going to try and back them up based on some of the ideas we've talked about. Let's take a Bosch common rail system from, I mean, it came into the US about, 2002. I guess there was a slight change 2004 to 2006 here on the Sprinters, right? 20 years later now, I'd argue that the technology that Bosch has produced has essentially created a better engine, more efficient. And many of the primary reasons a lot of Sprinter owners prefer the pre-2007 Sprinters is due to generally a far less complex emission system. So my argument is, in general, newer engines are generally better. Emission systems are tougher to work on.
I'd agree with that statement.
Yeah.
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 Absolutely.
So you've probably seen even whatever Cummins has been doing. You've seen a gradual increase in, technology has advanced in the last 20 years. The injectors are probably better. The high pressure pumps probably a little bit better. The tune things just a little bit more to make the engine run a little smoother. The tech for smooth idle running conditions and whatnot is a little bit better. Would that be fair to say? Or
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a time period in here from the early 2000s to now that diesels have become more popular outside of just, we'll call it industry. And with that, as competition, and competition always drives innovation. It makes people get better. I think you're correct that outside of the emissions equipment that's tied to modern diesel engines, the internal engine components themselves have gotten better. They've come up with better ways of doing things, better materials, better surface finishes, better coatings. All of those things have advanced to make the engines better, but there's been an added burden placed on those engines to meet the emissions regulations that have come along. And that's what challenges these engines, is the stuff that is bolted to them. And it's pretty obvious, like when someone deletes a vehicle, from my perspective. As an oil analyst, it's pretty easy to spot when someone deletes a power stroke. Like, you can't hide it. Like, it's so dramatic difference. It's like, oh, that's deleted.
what effects does that have on soot content within the engine or engine life?
Soot goes way down. Fuel dilution goes way down. Wear goes way down. It's insane how much of a difference there is. Now, that engine is one that is more susceptible than others to fuel dilution problems because of the strategy that they've used to do the DPF regens. So that 2000 to 2024 or 2023 power stroke, 6.773s, that late injection, and it's just pouring fuel into the engine. So it's not uncommon to see 6, 7, 8% fuel dilution in the oil routinely.
And this circles back. Yeah, this circles back to your discussion on post injection, right? Mm-hmm. And just to be specific here, if there's any people watching it who have one of the more modern Fords with like that 9th injector that's just pushes it straight into the exhaust. We're not talking about that. We're talking post injection.
Lucky if you got one of those.
Right. We're talking post injection within the cylinder.
In the cylinder, right? Yeah, that's a key thing, because there are people that are using that extra injector and they're doing that injection downstream of the exhaust valve, which is great because then it doesn't have any really negative effect on the engine in terms of engine oil fuel dilution. But when you're doing a secondary injection while the exhaust valve is open to try to light the DPF and burn it off, that's where you get into problems.
Yeah,
and part of that is the fact that when that exhaust valve is open, there's no cylinder pressure or very little cylinder pressure, it can't seal the piston rings. Piston rings are gas activated. They don't seal by by the tension alone. It's from the cylinder pressure. So when you start spraying fuel in a cylinder where there's no cylinder pressure, the rings aren't going to seal very well. They don't.
Yeah, so this kind of sparks a huge chain of questions. I'm gonna start. I don't want to get too sidetracked. We'll start with one cylinder ring question because it was brought up. The presence of a PCV vacuum on your system.
Right.
The argument was, and again, this may or may not. Forced induction engine may play into this as well. The argument was if you don't have that diesel style PCV vacuum, the cylinder rings don't seal up as well.
That's
on a
true.
Forced induction engine.
When you create crankcase vacuum, you're generating a greater pressure differential between the pressure in the cylinder and the pressure in the crankcase. Again, rings are gas activated. So the two ways of doing it is increasing pressure up here
or decreasing
pressure
down
there.
Right. Now let's apply that to a forced induction engine. This the turbocharger claims it can get up to 40 psi in the system. I haven't really seen one go past mid-20s, but they variable gate fancy turbocharger, whatever. Is that a meaning? That added psi or two that is within the engine just due to the fact that there may not be a vacuum. Is that a meaningful pressure differential for the rings not to seal up enough, or is it we're kind of just splitting hairs at this point and it's not really
pretty much splitting hairs?
Yeah.
And when you have boost, you got cylinder pressure, that it really does help with the rings 100%. I guess you could get back to our idle thing. If you're idling and you're very low engine speed, very low boost, and you don't have positive crankcase ventilation, and so you've got a couple more psi of pressure in there, probably the rings don't seal as well as if you could bring that pressure down in the crankcase or create a greater pressure differential just by a higher idle, whatever it is that would bring the pressure up. So the piston rings don't know. They don't know what those numbers are. They just respond to the differential.
right. Let's see if we can close the discussion on post injection and how it sort of relates to everything here. You mentioned a few minutes ago the issue with people who have modified their Power Strokes. Just as an example, it can be any diesel engine. It sounds like any modern forced induction diesel engine. Why post injection exists in a modern diesel for one.
Oh, okay. So the reason we have post injection is that it brings up the temperature and will burn off the soot collected in the DPF. So if you don't burn it off, it just causes a back pressure. So the system is reading pressure across the DPF, and when the DPF gets clogged, you have that fuel going down the exhaust, which is trying to burn off the built up soot so that you get rid of that pressure barrier, if you will, or flow barrier, and get the pressure back down where it's supposed to be. And the thing is, so the soot from the engine can cause that. The ash content in the oil can play into that. Also, the level of biodiesel in your fuel can play into that. Biodiesel tends to create more soot than regular diesel does. So there's a lot of different things that can factor in. I mean, depending upon the treat rate of your fuel additive. I mean, diesel fuel in the U.S. doesn't have detergent additives in it. Typically doesn't have detergent additives in it compared to, let's say, in Europe, where they have premium diesel that has a higher detergent package in it. So in the U.S., putting in a detergent package can keep those injectors clean so that you have better atomization, so you get less soot and all those kind of good things. Also, too, with high pressure common rail systems, the CP4 pumps, we're really concerned about that. So with high pressure common rail. Now we've got CP pour pumps. We're worried about making those things live. So lubricity is an issue both for the modern engines and for the older pintle style injectors. When you went away from higher sulfur diesel, where that sulfur was acting as a lubricant, to low sulfur diesel, ultra low sulfur diesel, you saw the advent of using lubricity additives in the fuel to protect the older style injectors. And now we're worried about pump. So lubricity of the fuel is something people care about. And that's the nice side of biodiesel. Biodiesel typically has really great lubricity. So maybe you don't have to worry so much about that, but now you have to worry about the soot part of it. But if someone says, okay, well, I'm going to go get this bottle of additive, and if one bottle is good, well, two must be better. It doesn't really work that way. It can work against you, actually, and cause more fuel dilution and more issues. So, fuel additives are a good thing, but too liberal of a use of fuel additive can cause issues with fuel dilution and DPF regens. So you want to be careful about all that.
That's very interesting. And that leads me to a small side question, and that I'm sure you've heard of this product, Liqui-Moly Diesel Purge.
Yep.
Yeah. Thoughts on how to use that, when to use that, frequency, or maybe just general thoughts on how
I've
often?
heard of it. I don't know the product well enough to speak intelligently about it.
Okay, fair enough.
My kind of default product I go back to is the Power Service Diesel Clean is the only one that's endorsed by Cummins. And
Interesting.
I will default to Cummins research and testing, because they don't just go put their name on anything.
Mm-hmm.
That if they put their name on it, it wasn't because they wrote them a giant check. Now, was there a check involved? I'm sure there was. But I also know the engineers at Cummins well enough that they're an engineering company first, and they want to protect their engines. And the no harms is a bigger part, where if the only evidence that you have that this is a good product is a bench test from a lab, that's really not enough. You need engine testing to prove out any kind of additive, for your fuel. And again, having worked with Cummins in the past and understand their mentality and know the resources they have, they didn't rely on a lab test to tell them, this stuff works pretty good. They ran it in engines without back and forth and said, yeah, we see positives with this. So yeah, we'll endorse it. Then the guys write them a big giant check for it, but not until the engineering guy signed off on it. And I trust them more than I trust, lubricity testers and cetane testers in the lab. Not that that's not good information. I have a video about that. But at the end, I also default to, okay, this is all great information, but I'm going to go with what those guys said because they know more than we do. They tested it more.
Yeah. And just for everyone who's listening, Cummins system using a Bosch fuel delivery system and one that's in your Mercedes Sprinter, it's going to be exactly the same from what it needs from a lubricity standpoint. That would be fair to say. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And the thing is, with these modern high pressure common rails, you have high pressures, you have very tight tolerances. Fuel cleanliness is really important. I just got back from going up to Minnesota and spending some time with the guys at Donaldson. Your fuel filters are one of the most important things in your engine. And it's really important to make sure that you're using a filter that has a very high efficiency at the micron rating that the OEM specified. Don't get sucked in to these really, really low micron filters, because I can say I have a 2 micron filter as long as I had it removed 1 2 micron particle.
Oh, okay. So make sure it's spec'd at the micron level of the OEM. Of the OEM manufacturer,
Yeah,
and you
because
don't
the
need
OEM has
anything
talked
less.
to injector supplier, and they know that, oh, we need to target these micron size particles, and it's usually going to be in that 2 to probably 6 micron range is what it is for diesel fuel injectors. We need to target there. We need to have a very high efficiency in that range.
Through the
You would rather have to replace your fuel filters every year than replace your engine.
right because of the potential for particles to get through, not necessarily a fuel speed, fuel delivery speed.
Scared me,
right?
right? I'm giving away the farm here on a future video, but I'm gonna tell you right now. The ASTM spec for diesel fuel cleanliness is about 40 years old. You can have a fuel that meets spec that has nearly 1 billion particles in it per liter. 1 billion per liter.
You're scaring every single diesel owner.
That would still be in
right
spec,
yeah.
right? Fortunately, if you go to a gas pump, say a QT or whatever, you're probably talking about having 3 million particles or so per liter. When that fuel gets to your injector, it needs to be less than 30,000. Only thing between the dirtiness of your fuel and keeping your injector alive are your fuel filters. So it's something that no one really thinks about, but that's not a place to shortcut. Now, really important to understand about filters too. Don't say, well, I'm just going to start changing my filters every month, because filters get better the longer they live.
Expand on that.
Dirt likes dirt. So the old chemistry saying like likes like. Why do we have pieces of steel? It's because iron atoms want to bond with other iron atoms. So if we can put some carbon in there, which carbon likes to bond with carbon, now we can make steel, because these atomic elements like to stick together. That same principle applies to dirt and everything else, soot. So the contaminants that are in your fuel that get caught in the filter grab other contaminants that are trying to make it through the filter, because filters are not 100% effective. If you send 1,000, let's call it 10 micron size particles to the filter, well, if it's call it an absolute filter, that means it's 50%. So, absolute is 98.76. There's another term, skipped my mind, but it's like one of the terms you'll see in filtration. Like one of the standard terms for filtration basically means 50%. So 1,000 particles, 10 microns headed to the filter, 500 of them are getting through. And that's normal. An absolute filter, you're only getting 98.76% efficiency, which doesn't sound like much, but it's actually quite a bit of stuff getting through, especially when you think about 3 million particles headed that way. What does that look like? Because it's not 3% of them getting through. It's a measurement of efficiency. The actual particle count is going to be different. The beta ratio is what you're looking for. So just for example, a beta ratio of 100 means that For 1,000 particles headed that way, 100 got through. You can, I'm doing this from off the top of my head. I could have gotten that slightly wrong. Just
Sure.
FYI,
Okay.
I'm the motor oil geek, not the oil filter geek. The filter guys are the guys who are experts at this. But put it this way, there's a giant difference between 99% efficient and 99.9% efficient.
Okay. So
that 1% is massive.
Right. And arguably a lot tougher to get that last
a whole lot tougher to get.
Yeah.
So when it comes to fuel filters, that is not an area to cheap out and go guinea pigging your vehicle with on, somebody's latest, greatest, -4 micron filter they have, that, can filter pixie dust. I would be very worried about that. I would stick to what the OEM is specifying in terms of
and this
particle
is
size and efficiency. It's both and. You have to have both to have a picture of what the filter does. Efficiency by itself doesn't tell you much. Micron size by itself doesn't tell you much. It's the combination of the two that tells you where it's at.
Right. So your argument would be that most filters who have these claims, it's really just sort of clever marketing as opposed to actual real filtration ability. Would that be fair to say?
Perfect example. I looked this up the other day with a very well-known brand oil filter. And I was looking at two different ones, and I looked at their 3 different grades of filters. And I believe one of them had like a 95% efficiency at 20 microns. And that was like their substandard, like their basic filter, right? Then their mid-grade was 99% at 20 microns. Well, much better.
Mm-hmm.
But then they claimed 99.9 on their premium filter. But that was at 46 microns.
Well, that's
so efficiency was
right?
95, 99, 99.99. Ooh, we're really good. Oh, but you didn't pay attention to the fine details. Follow that asterisk to the bottom of the page. 20, 20. Okay, those are okay for engine oil filters. 46. Whoa, what's that? So you got to look at the fine details.
Yeah. So I mean, from a volumetric standpoint, 46 versus 20? That's really how many orders of magnitude bigger?
Yeah, it is. It is orders of magnitude larger particles. Like, well, of course it got 99.9% of that big giant rock.
There you go. You
know, that's not clearance size, right? It's like particles that are larger, substantially larger than the clearance, or substantially smaller than the clearance, either will not pass through, so they won't do any damage, or they just go right through and cause no damage. It's the particles that are near clearance size. Those are the ones that do all the damage.
Gotcha.
So for engines, for bearings, you're using that 15 to 20 micron range is about what that operating clearance is. So that 15 to 20 microns on the particle sizes, that's really important. 46 is not important.
Just for clarity, since we're discussing both engine oil filters and fuel filters right now, I believe for these Mercedes Sprinters, I believe it's about 40,000 miles or so right now for every fuel filter change. I believe it's maintenance B. I want to kind of bring this all back later and discuss oil intervals a little bit later, but for the fuel filter interval specifically, what would you say is a reasonable interval? Do they kind of have that one down? Would you say?
Talking to the guys at Donaldson, they say, listen, stick to what the OEM says, right?
Okay.
Follow their intervals. Like, don't go short, don't go longer. Do what they say.
Okay, and that logic doesn't carry over to oil change intervals, which I'm sure we'll get to later on, right?
Correct.
Wonderful. Now, one last thing about the oil filter itself. if you are dealing with a fuel dilution issue where potentially there's a lot of diesel getting into your fuel, would that affect your oil filter's interval at all? Would it degrade the filter in any way?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I mean, usually what you're going to end up doing is you're going to end up having to change the oil sooner because you have a fuel dilution problem. And usually the best thing to do is when you change your oil, go ahead and change your filter. Even if the filter could last longer, the the U.S. Navy several years ago did a very detailed study on what was the best way to go about maintenance, especially on high value asset equipment, fighter jets, nuclear subs, stuff like that, right? And what they found is that if you just went on a scheduled time-based maintenance, they had more failures than if they used predictive models. So if they did things like oil analysis and vibration analysis and things like that, that would give them early warning of when they needed to do maintenance, they had much fewer issues because every time you do maintenance, there's an opportunity to, one, do it wrong, and number two, introduce contamination. So the idea that, okay, my oil filter might last 20,000 miles and it will work better that last 5,000 miles than my oil. Therefore, I'm going to just change my oil every 10,000 miles and my filter every 20,000 miles. Okay, I see where you're going, but you better make sure that your oil can make it 10,000 miles. Because if it can't, and you're having to do 3 oil changes for every filter change, now you're doing maintenance 3 or 4 times versus only doing it twice. You want to limit the number of times you touch it.
And I imagine that it's even more crucial for the fuel filter, given the
right. That's part of the overhead. Don't change it sooner. Don't mess with it. Right? Just leave it alone, but change it when they tell you to. Don't forget about it. Just do it right.
Gotcha. Well, just to circle back on that post-injection one more time, just to kind of solidify the ideas we were discussing. Just for context, and please let me know if I'm wrong on this, I believe the way post-injection exists is that it exists during the regen cycle. Would that be some form of regen?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. It's there for regen. Yes.
Right. And you might, and during regular operating, you're probably not getting a whole lot of post-injection. Maybe some pre-injection for making the engine idle a little smoother. But it's primarily there for when it needs to heat things up to burn off that soot from the DPF. Would that be?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's why it exists.
Right. And again, it's really tough to get for me to find data on this, but there was a very compelling argument that I heard, and just for clarity for everyone listening, when we discuss diesel particulate filter regeneration, we are discussing it can kind of be separated into 3 parts. We have passive regeneration, where your engine's just running normally and you're maybe going down the highway and it gets hot enough for those particles to burn off through the filter by itself. Then we have the active and the forced regen, right? Where active regen, you're driving and the engine kicks in, it will go through that process. Glow plugs light up, more fuel gets dumped in, it gets cleaned out. Now, the forced regen is a little more interesting. I've seen very compelling arguments for if you have to do a forced regen. And when we're discussing forced regen, we're talking about hitting that button on a scan tool as kind of a last resort. It usually happens at a shop, but more and more people are doing it on their own these days because of the way scan tools are getting more affordable and more. Anyway, I could talk about that all day. But when you do a forced regen, you probably want to get an oil change right after, simply because of the extreme amount of that post-injection occurring. Have you heard about this argument? Is there any validity to it?
I haven't heard that, but
yeah.
it stands to reason that, okay, yeah, if you're going to do this deep clean like that, you ought to at least do an oil sample to make sure,
There you go.
right?
Right. Yeah.
To see what you ended up with when you were all said and done with that. It's funny, back to the idling thing when you were talking about that, we'll call it the passive regen. I got a good friend of mine who works at Caterpillar, and it's he's asked me the same thing. It's like, hey, let's work together to create some educational videos because they're seeing that with the newer equipment, with all the emissions equipment on it, that people are out there idling stuff all day long, keeping it at the ready, and they're seeing more, soot related issues, more EGR related issues because you never reach that passive regen state. It's just, you're just clogging it and loading it. So you're having to make the computer go in there and doing it is just a downward spiral. So they're seeing dramatically reduced life on equipment that's not being used properly because of if you're never reaching that passive state, it's really hard on equipment.
Yeah. I mean, the ideal scenario is you just get passive regen, right? Maybe you own a Sprinter, you're a hotshot rider, you're on the freeway the whole time.
Yep.
I've seen a gentleman with I think it was 2019, 2020 Sprinter, over 500,000 miles, 530 something. Never had to get anything done with all his emissions stock, never messed with it or anything, and I don't think he does any sort of active regen too much just because he's, driving down the freeway. Now, let's circle this idea back to how does the regen take place? You mentioned the existence of the pressure differential within the DPF and how that tends to trigger it, right? A certain amount of back pressure will cause that to happen. Now, on Sprinters, it's generally about, I think it's just a couple PSI back pressure. But, there's plenty of instances where that regen doesn't occur and, the DPF gets all blocked up for one reason or another, and they're driving around or idling with, even up to like 7 or 8 PSIs of back pressure. From like a theoretical standpoint, what does that do to this? Does the back pressure increase the fuel dilution? Does it have potential to increase soot?
So back pressure is going to basically function like EGR. You're going to have more inert gas in the combustion chamber, which is going to lower combustion temperature, which when that happens, you typically get less complete combustion in some of this stuff, right? So you're bringing the NOx levels down, which is the type of emissions, and that typically drives up soot. Again, that's back to the whole, that's the other part of EGR, is that not only are we rebreathing the soot, but we're also bringing down combustion temperatures that actually causes the engine to generate more soot. So it is a double whammy, which is why all this stuff, right? I was like, you can start talking off about diesels, you're going to end up talking about soot. You're going to talk about EGRs, and you're going to talk about DPS, and you're going to talk about regens, because end of the day, that's the weak link.
Since we're on the topic of emissions, this might be a great time to tell you I have an in-depth video of a very common pattern failure that occurs on these Sprinters, which seems like nobody's talking about. So go ahead and click this video here or find it in the description towards the end of the video. Yeah.
And back to oil change intervals, that's why you can't just trust the OEM to say, well, they said go 5,000 miles or go 10,000 miles or whatever number they gave you, is because, as we've already discussed, there's all these operating variables. Are you in a cold climate? Do you have a high level of biodiesel? Are you in a hot environment? Are you hot shot driving? Are you sitting there letting it idle all day? All of these things we've discussed, we made clear, all influence soot creation. Well, that's all going to influence oil life. So there's no way the OEM can give you one number that's right for all the other applications. Now, one of the other differences between the OEM recommendation for oil or say fuel filter changes and oil changes is that the EPA is not giving them credit for delaying fuel filter changes, but the EPA gives OEMs credit for generating less waste oil.
I want to kind of really hammer this idea home to everyone watching. Now, if I was playing devil's advocate here and said, you know what, manufacturer says 20,000 miles, manufacturer says 25,000 miles, who are you? Why are you smarter than the manufacturer? Now, you've given the EPA the reason for the EPA. Is there a couple other reasons? I know you've mentioned them in your videos. Let's see if we can really hammer
I'm
this
not
point
smarter
home.
than the OEM, but yeah, the OEM has different incentives
Right.
than you do, right?
Yeah.
Lower cost of ownership is one of them, right? So if they factor in that when they're being rated by the different independent rating agencies, the cost of ownership is part of that. So if you have a 25,000 mile drain interval versus a 5,000 mile drain interval, then you're cutting your oil change cost by an order of magnitude of 5. It's a massive difference, right? By having much longer drain intervals. Also, too, you have the EPA bit of it, but then the other piece of this is most of those extended drain intervals are also based on, we'll call it normal operating conditions. Well, pretty interesting. If you go look at, say, a Ford owner's manual for a Power Stroke, severe duty is idling.
Yep.
That defines severe duty as idle. So back to when you go to severe duty, that drain interval normally is cut in half just by that. So what they say, again, read the fine print and then begin to look. But you have to pay attention to not just what the EPA, or you got to pay attention not to what just the OEM is saying. You got to read that fine print. But then to really get your oil change intervals right, you need to do used oil analysis. Without that data, you are just trusting blindly. And that's what it is. It's this blind trust that someone else or whatever you've come up with is correct. In today's world, like you said, we have scan tools. You don't have to not know. You don't have to guess. You can plug it in and you get data and know. Used oil analysis is the scan tool for your oil change interval. It's going to tell you what's going on. You measure it, then you can know it. Then based on that, you begin to manipulate what you're doing. Either how you use the vehicle, what oil you use, or your oil change interval. You can fit it to your application. That way you're getting the maximum life out of the vehicle by doing that. I mean, it literally is that simple.
Yeah, and I really want to dig into used oil analysis later on. I am on a mission to make my Sprinter van last forever. But in order to do that, I need to find the best oil and the best service interval. So I'm going to need you to let me send you free stuff. Let me explain. I'll be sending out free oil analysis kits to Sprinter owners who complete this form. Now, I may not be able to send one out to everyone, at least not quite yet. But if you think your Sprinter van drives in unique conditions, or you use a unique oil, or a uniquely high drain interval, then I want to get a sample of your oil. Now, Lakespeed's company is going to be analyzing the oil. So if you want to know if your engine is receiving the type of care to help it last forever, but maybe you don't want to wait for me to send you out a kit, then you're able to buy a kit from him directly. But if you do that, please, please, please do not forget to send me a copy of your results. The more data points we can get from different areas of the country with different fuel quality, weather, driving conditions, the more accurate conclusions we can make for every Sprinter owner out there. So check out the links to my 1-minute form and to his website if you're interested. Now, just to kind of summarize what you were saying, from when the manufacturers put out these numbers, there's certain incentives, like sort of EPA credit, so to speak, of saying, hey, our vehicle, requires longer oil intervals. It's more arguably more, quote, green, better for the environment, right? Then there's the argument of cost of ownership, which to my understanding, it's usually only measured in the first 5 years of the vehicle, right? You'd have to be pretty terrible to your engine, especially these diesels, for them not to last, 5 years or 100, 120,000 miles if it's the absolute extended warranty from what I can see right now. Is there a small component, do you think, and again, this is probably more on the opinion side, of sort of these planned obsolescence where it's like, hey, our vehicle's made it past warranty. We don't necessarily care too much about a vehicle after it hits that 100, 120,000 miles. And we know that.
I honestly think from the OEM's perspective that they're seeing such a wide range of vehicle life, not because of how they built it, but it's what's been done to it once it gets out there. If people will actually follow all the OEM guidance and do it by the letter, not what they can get away with, they probably have pretty good outcomes, more times than not. Like the people who really are doing severe duty driving, as defined in the owner's manual, actually follow those oil change intervals, and probably most of the time they probably work out pretty okay. Are there going to be variances? Absolutely, there's going to be variances, because what about fuel's not the same, the environment's not the same. Someone in Texas is probably going to have a little bit longer vehicle life than a guy in Canada, because that colder weather is going to be harder on that engine than the hotter weather is going to be. I think they're seeing so many different data points that they're saying, okay, we can make these changes to make the EPA and these other people happy, and it's really not having a gross effect on the aggregate. Now, when someone has a problem, they're going to blame those things as the reason for why they had a problem. But unless you have all the data that says that problem caused it, then you're just speculating.
Right. So one thing I've seen, I've tried to look through owner's manuals over the last 15 or about 20 years or so, in order to kind of get an idea over the generations of the recommendations. And I've tried to look at them from different continents, actually, just to kind of get an idea for what's different, right? One of the trends I was seeing was oil intervals getting bigger as emissions got more stringent. You would think that would be kind of the opposite. In addition to that, okay, so they have this, let's use the V6 Sprinter engine that's probably still in 90% of the Sprinters, and it's in close to 100% of Sprinters between 2007 to 2022. They held on to that thing for like 15, 16 years. It's pretty much the standard engine. They put that engine in a Mercedes SUV. Because of the smaller space, the oil pan holds about, I think, at least 4 quarts less of oil.
Ooh, now, that hurts.
In addition to that, they needed that SUV to sit right next to the gas-powered SUVs and the V8 gas-powered SUVs, and say, oh, it makes similar horses, it has similar, horsepower for that salesman to be able to sell these things. So it's tuned about 100 horses more than the vans.
Ooh.
Right? So you have 30 to 40% less oil, tuned probably to, a lot more than the vans. And still, I don't see a lot of real differences in the oil change interval. So that's kind of got my, what would you call it? My conspiracy brain working a little bit. And I'm
if there was ever your case to say, are these completely engineering driven decisions, or is there an outside influence on this? I think you just outlined the perfect case scenario that says, not too sure about that.
Yeah, let's look at this a little closer, kind of thing. And what's interesting too is that the failure rate for the SUVs is a lot. You're You're lucky to get 250,000 miles on the SUVs. I've seen the Sprinters go up north of 800,000. Older ones, pre-emissions, they say it can last 1,000,000 miles. I've only seen like maybe 1 or 2 really get there, but it's this idea of like it can be a forever engine if you're really, really cautious about it. So, maybe that's a good leeway into this next line of questioning. At a glance, this channel's just about fixing stuff. But on a deeper level, it's more about having the right to fix the things and vehicles that you own. Now, Mercedes is making it tougher and tougher for owners like you and me to fix our stuff. Even so much as newer headlights now require a special barcode reader and dealership software just to be able to pair that headlight unit with your ECU. Now, if you've found value in this video and you care about keeping your right to fix the damn things that you own, and even to be able to do so better than the dealership, then go ahead and click those buttons down below to help this message reach more people. If you bought a brand new Sprinter today, oil analysis, I'm sure, is going to play a big part in this. How would you break it in? You plan to make it last as long as it can. How would you break it in, and how would you then sort of treat it in order to make it last forever? Obviously, 1,000 variables here, but what can you do with that question?
Yeah, general answer would be drive it off the lot. Get it warm. Get it warmed up, then just drive it. I would never baby it. Not push it in a red line. But the thing is, I would not baby it from day one. You go out there and you start driving it. You put load to it. Piston rings need load for them to work and to break in. So I want to break in my rings quickly, which means I'm going to go out there and start driving. I'm going to find some hills. I'm going to have high load, low speed on the engine. Get high torque, because peak torque is peak cylinder pressure. That's going to get the rings to break in. I'm going to do that for the first couple hundred miles, and I'm going to change the oil, and I'm going to get all that junk out of there, because break-in is the number one time for the highest level of wear in the engine normally. And I want all that particulate out. So I'm going to do probably 2 or 3 early oil changes. The first one is going to be within 500 miles. The second one will be within a couple thousand miles. And the third one will be within 4,000 miles. And so by the time the engine has maybe 5,000 miles on it, it's going to have 3 oil changes in it to get all of the early break-in debris out. But I'm never going to baby it once during that time.
Just to be clear, maybe, and you said get it up to speed, so maybe like the first 5 minutes of driving, you're not going full throttle. It's
you're not going full throttle.
10 minutes.
You don't go out there and go hook up a trailer, off day one. But what you're going to do is you're going to go, drive it around until the temperature, oil temperature or water temperature is up to the normal range, right? Then I'll go find some hills and go climb up some hills, And I'm going to, and on the way downhill, I'm going to engine brake on the way down the hill, right? Not just drag the brake pedal. I'm going to engine brake going down. I'm going to go climb the hill going up, and that's how I'm going to drive the vehicle, for that first, couple hundred miles. And that's good, because you don't want to put a trailer or anything behind there yet, because you still need the differential to break in. Right? We're not just worried about the engine, we're about the differential and stuff too. So you want to give all those things time to break in before we start putting even higher loads on it. Give those asperities, those rough pieces, to a chance to kind of come in. But we also want to make sure, as those things are coming in, we're getting them out. We're not going to rely on the filter alone, because we already know it can't do everything to get it all out of there. So the combination of those two things, will do a good job getting an engine to break in. We see the worst results from people who baby cars. And the bad thing is with some of these hybrids, it's self-imposed babying, and you get the worst results. You get higher fuel dilution and higher wear from hybrids than you do the non-hybrid engines from the same manufacturer.
That is really interesting. And it's really tough for someone who has a pride of ownership. They want to be very cautious with their vehicle. It's probably the toughest thing to really just kind of stomp on that pedal, even if the thing's warmed up and ready to go. That's interesting. Now, you mentioned engine braking. Now, these are automatic transmissions, but they do have the paddle shifter. You can drop them a gear. Is that recommended just for general driving if you're going down big hills
I mean,
and, you know,
if you're yes, it's a way of
Yeah.
making your brakes last longer. Generally speaking, but for during engine braking, it's good to do some engine braking.
Okay.
To do that. Obviously, that's another strategy you can employ. Make your brakes last longer. Otherwise, engines are tough. They like they're racehorses really.
Yeah.
They like to be worked. They don't do good just sitting in pasture doing nothing.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Lake, I appreciate your time. Thanks
Happy
for
to do
doing
it.
this.
Glad to do it.